Now we kind of built that up slowly in pieces, so it's not quite as complicated. If you look at that formula, it's a pretty big formula. But each of those pieces made sense, and it's just a bunch of, we add some things in for variable costs, add some things in for salvage, take away, we take away our variable cost, add for the salvage sales, take away for our lost sales, and we take away for our fixed costs. And those are just some various if statements. Again, a lot of that's really easy to do in your head. A little bit tougher to do in Excel, but once you do it in Excel, we can go changing all these things real quick without having to redo the math. Change that to 50, and makes it a real snap to do that. Okay, now let's take a look at the next step. Now, if you remember, one of the things I held off and didn't put in here was our probabilities and the different scenarios. But let's first go ahead and build just a quick table here. And let's say that our different demand that we had from our problem would be, at least there could be 50 that were demanded. There could be 60, and this is customers that want to buy your product, and there would be 75. Well, how many could we produce? Well, we could produce 0. And if we know these are the only valid values that people would possibly demand, then these are the 3 that we would obviously choose to stock. So we could stock either 50, 60, or 75. And our problem tells us that we have a different likelihood that each one of these demands that are here are going to happen. So the problem tells us that there is a 60% chance, or 0.6, that demand would be 50. It tells us that there is a 30% chance, or 0.3, that there's 60, and then 0.1, or 10% chance at 75. So what we want to figure out is, well, what would our profits be in these 12 boxes? Now we could just manually go in here and calculate this by hand. What we could also do is change these values. If I changed my, now if you remember, up here is the demand, and I'll click a little button here on Excel that spreads that out. And over here we have our production. So we are going to, if we have demand of 50 and production of 0, we have demand of 50 and production of 0, we have negative 50. So we could just put the negative 50 in right here, minus 50, and we could just begin building our table that way. You know, for our value out here of 75 and 75, we could just plug 75 in here and plug 75 in here, and we end up with profit of $325. Okay, well, that's the long way of doing it. Let me show you a quick way of doing it, and it's called using data table. We've seen this a couple of other times in some other areas, but this is really what data table was designed to make easy. Imagine if you had 20 columns and 100 rows of information. It would take forever to do it the way we just did it. So to do a data table, it's going to calculate all these values for us automatically. And obviously you can't use data table with a pencil and paper. This is one of the things that makes Excel awesome. So the first thing that we do with a data table is take the top left-hand cell, which is right here. This is the data that we're going to try to fill in is right here. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. Yellow. This is the area that we want data table to fill in. But the area that we want it to use these demand numbers, and we want it to use these production numbers, and we want it to replace these. We want it to put these numbers into the demand cell here, and we want it to put these numbers right here into the production cell right here, and then calculate all these values for us. And here's how we do that. First thing we want to do is point this top left cell. We're going to use data table on this area. This top left cell needs to be pointed to what you want these values to ultimately be calculated. So I'm going to hit the equals key and point that to my profit cell. So in this case, that's the value 7575 that would go right here. The next step is oh so easy. We just highlight this whole area, including the column headings, the row headings, and that little box there that had that pointer. Now we don't need to worry about these probabilities down here. We're going to use those later. In this case, we're going to go to Data, Table, and right here, this tends to be a little bit confusing, but where it says Row Input Cell, I'm going to point to the value that corresponds with these guys up here, the demand area. So I'm going to point to the 75. And the column input cell, I'm going to point to the value in our parameters that corresponds to the production values that are right here. And now I'm just going to say OK. Boop. There we go. Now, wasn't that great? That could have been, again, 100 rows and 20 columns. It would have calculated that fast. And the beautiful thing about that is, let's say that we get a word from a customer and we're going to, the salvage value now we think we can get $6. Look, it recalculated everything for us. Take that back to 5. Let's say that our price now is going to be $26. It recalculates all these values in the table for us automatically. Let's take that back to 25. Okay, now, if we have no idea what we should be doing here, which one of these production values, again, these are our production values over here in this side right here, and we really don't know we don't know what the demand is going to be in the future, so we've got to figure out some way to figure out how much we should produce in the future. We don't have a good forecast model. We just have to kind of make a decision. Now, if we used our maxi-min strategy, we're going to maximize we're going to take a look at the worst case scenario and pick the production value that is going to give us the best of our worst case scenarios. So what's the worst case scenario here? We're going to lose 50. Worst case scenario here is we make 175. Worst case scenario here, we make 50. Worst case scenario here, we lose. So obviously, in our maxi-min strategy, 50 is going to be our production value. Now how about our maxi-max? This is our optimistic guy. What's the best case scenario of this entire table? It's going to be here. So our maxi-max guy is going to say right there. Well, what about if we do know the probabilities that these things are going to happen? Now in this case, we know that our probability of demand being 50 is going to be 60%. 60% of the time, demand is going to be 50. So what we'll do is we'll calculate what the expected profit would be if we produce each one of these different values here. So in this case, we're going to say 0.6 times minus 50. We're going to say our probability times our negative 50, and then we're going to add that to the probability of 0.3 times our 0.6. So we're going to say plus 0.3 times 0.6 plus 0.1 times negative 0.75. Now what this is going to give us is if we pick a production of 0, over the course of time, our profits every week are going to average negative 55.5. That's not so great. You guys that are really kind of watching what I'm doing here probably notice that if I want to drag this down, what I should have done is made these absolute references to this bottom row down here. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So any of these cases where I've got this blue, purple, and the green, I'm going to anything that's got a 17 in it, I'm going to go ahead and hit F4. I'm going to highlight that, hit F4, hit F4, hit F4. Now when I drag this down, we can see what happens. Now in this case, we have our profits of negative 55.5. We have profits of 194.5. We have profits here of 128.5, and we have profits of negative 65. You know, something doesn't look right. See if you guys can look and see what we're missing here.